In the previous lecture, we explored how React works internally. We learned several important concepts. These concepts helped us understand why React applications are fast and efficient. Now that we understand how React performs updates internally, the next step is to learn how developers actually write React applications. This brings us to one of the most important topic in React development known as JSX. Whenever you look at React code online in tutorials, documentation or real world projects, you will notice something interesting. This code will look very similar to HTML, but it is actually written in JavaScript files. This special syntax is called JSX. So in this lecture, you will learn about JSX, the syntax for it, the comparison between HTML and JSX, how you write expressions in JSX, the attributes, the conditional rendering and the compilation process in detail. Let us begin by understanding what JSX actually mean. JSX stands for JavaScript XML. Although its name contains the word XML, it is not actually XML. Similarly, although JSX looks exactly like HTML, it is not HTML either. Instead, JSX is simply a new syntax that allows developers to write user interface components in a much simpler way. Imagine writing JavaScript code without JSX. Creating even a simple web page would require multiple JavaScript function calls. The code would become lengthy and difficult to understand. JSX solves this problem by allowing developers to write HTML like tags directly inside JavaScript. For example, instead of writing multiple JavaScript functions, we can simply write a heading or paragraph exactly like HTML. Because of this familiar syntax, beginners who already know HTML can learn React much faster. However, remember one point: browsers cannot understand JSX directly. Before execution, JSX must first be converted into standard JavaScript. Before JSX existed, React developers used a function called react.createElement to build every element on the web page. Suppose we wanted to create a heading. Instead of writing a simple HTML tag, developers had to call the react.createElement function, specify the HTML tag, define its properties, and provide its content. Now imagine creating an entire web page using this method. A web page may contain hundreds of buttons, images, forms, and tables. Writing everything using JavaScript functions would quickly become confusing. To solve this problem, Facebook introduced JSX. With JSX, the same heading can simply be written using familiar HTML syntax. This makes the code much cleaner. It becomes easier for teams to work together because everyone can understand the structure immediately. Developers spend less time understanding code and more time building features. Now, let us understand what happens behind the scenes. When developers write JSX, browsers cannot execute it directly. Browsers understand only JavaScript. Therefore, before execution, JSX must be translated into normal JavaScript. This conversion is performed by a compiler called Babel. Babel reads the JSX syntax and converts it into react.createElement function calls. After conversion, React processes these JavaScript functions. React then creates the virtual DOM. It compares the virtual DOM with the previous version using the reconciliation algorithm. Only the necessary updates are sent to the real DOM. Finally, the browser displays the updated web page. The entire process happens automatically. As developers, we simply write JSX, React, and Babel handles everything else. Now that we have understood what JSX is and how it helps us write React applications more easily, let us learn about the syntax rules of JSX. These rules are extremely important because JSX is not exactly the same as HTML. Although it looks like HTML, JSX is actually JavaScript with an HTML-like syntax. Therefore, we must follow certain rules while writing JSX code. If these rules are not followed, Babel will not be able to compile the code and React will display compilation errors. Let us discuss each rule one by one with examples. The first rule is that every JSX expression must have a single parent element. Whenever a React component returns multiple HTML elements, all those elements must be enclosed inside one parent container. React components can return only one root element. If we try to return two or more elements side by side without wrapping them, React will generate an error because it does not know how to group those elements together. For example, suppose we write an H1 heading and immediately below it a P tag for paragraph without placing them inside another element. Although this may look correct, React will report an error because these are two separate root elements. To solve this problem, we simply wrap both elements inside the parent element such as div tag. This way, React only sees one root element and inside it there are multiple child elements. So, whenever you have multiple elements, always remember to wrap them inside a parent element or a React fragment. The second rule is that every JSX tag must be closed properly. This rule is different from normal HTML. In HTML, certain elements such as the image, input, and BR, HR tags are often written without closing tags because browsers automatically understand them. However, JSX follows XML syntax which is much stricter. Therefore, every tag must either have a closing tag or be returned as a self-closing tag. For example, when displaying an image, instead of writing only the open tag, we must end it with a forward slash before the closing angle bracket. Similarly, input fields, line breaks, and horizontal lines must also be written as self-closing tags. Therefore, while writing JSX, always make it a habit to properly close every element. The third rule is that attribute names follow camel case notation instead of normal HTML attribute names. Since JSX is actually JavaScript, some HTML attribute names cannot be used directly because they conflict with JavaScript keywords. A common example is the class attribute. In HTML, we use the class attribute to apply CSS styles to an element. However, in JSX, we cannot use the word class because class is already a reserved keyword in JavaScript for creating classes and objects. Instead, React uses class name. Another example is the for attribute used in labels. The fourth rule is that the JavaScript expressions must always be written inside curly braces. One of the biggest advantage of JSX is that it allows us to combine JavaScript and HTML like code within the same file. Whenever we want to display the value of a variable, perform a calculation, call a function, or access an object's property, we place the JavaScript expressions inside curly braces. For example, suppose we have a variable called name that stores the value John. Instead of typing the name directly into the HTML, we write the variable inside curly braces. React automatically replaces the variable with its actual value and displays it on the web page. Similarly, if we write an arithmetic expression such as 10 plus 20 inside curly braces, React evaluates the expression and displays the result, which is 30. We can also call functions, display object properties, or use expressions inside curly braces. However, one important point to remember is that only JavaScript expressions are allowed inside the curly braces. Let us look at a simple JSX example. Here we have a React component called app. Inside the return statement, we write HTML like code. Notice that everything is enclosed within a single division element. This follows the JSX rule of having one parent element. When React executes this component, it displays the heading hello and the name on the web page. Although it looks like HTML, it is actually JSX. Babel converts this code into JavaScript before execution. JSX is not limited to displaying variables alone. In fact, it allows us to use almost any JavaScript expressions inside the curly braces. This is one of the reasons why React is so flexible and widely used for building dynamic web applications. First, let us understand what a JavaScript expression is. An expression is any piece of JavaScript code that provides a value. Since it returns a value, React can evaluate it and display the result on the screen. The simplest example is displaying the value of the variable. Suppose we have a variable called student name that stores the value, for example, Ananya. Instead of typing the name directly in the HTML, we can simply place the variable inside curly braces. React evaluates the variable and displays its value. If the value changes later, React automatically updates the user interface without requiring us to refresh the page. Another useful feature is performing mathematical calculations directly inside JSX. We can write arithmetic expressions such as addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division within the curly braces. This is very useful in applications such as shopping websites, student result portals, or banking systems where calculations are performed frequently. JSX also allows us to call JavaScript functions instead of writing all the logic inside the JSX code. Developers usually write reusable functions and simply call them whenever needed. For example, suppose we have a function called getGreeting that returns the message good morning. By calling this function inside braces, React executes the function and displays the returned value. This keeps the JSX code clean while separating the application logic into reusable functions. Another common use is accessing object properties. In JavaScript, data is often stored inside objects. For example, consider a student object containing properties such as name, age, and department. If we want to display only the student's name, we simply access the name property inside the curly braces. This feature is extremely useful because most real world applications receive data from databases or APIs in the form of objects. Similarly, JSX can display values stored in arrays. Arrays are used to store collections of data such as list of students, subjects, products, or employees. We can display individual elements by referring to their index or use array methods to process the data. Later, when we learn about rendering list in React, we will see how arrays are used to generate multiple user interface elements automatically. Another useful feature supported by the JSX is the use of template literals. Literals allow us to combine text and variables in a simple and readable way. Instead of joining multiple strings using the plus operator, we can create meaningful sentences by embedding variables directly into the text. This makes the code cleaner and much easier to understand, especially when displaying personalized messages or formatted informations. Now, let us move on to another important feature of JSX, which is JSX attributes. If you have already worked with HTML, you are familiar with attributes such as ID, class, src, alt, and disabled. These attributes provide additional information about an HTML element and define how that element behaves or appears on the web page. JSX also supports attributes similar to HTML. However, since JSX is actually a syntax extension of JavaScript, it provides much more flexibility than traditional HTML. One of the biggest advantage is that attribute values can be dynamic. In HTML, attribute values are usually fixed or static. For example, if we specify the source of an image or the text inside an element, those values remain the same unless the HTML file is manually modified. In JSX, we are not limited to fixed values. Instead, we use JavaScript variables, expressions, function calls, or calculations as attribute values. To do this, we simply place the JavaScript code inside curly braces. This approach makes application more dynamic because the displayed image can change simply by updating the value of the variable without modifying the JSX code itself. Similarly, suppose we have a variable called button color. Instead of assigning a fixed color to the button, we can dynamically set the button's background color using that variable. If the variable changes, React automatically updates the appearance of the button. In HTML, Boolean attributes such as disabled, checked, or required are usually written as plain text. For example, in HTML, we simply write disabled to disable a button or an input field. This is very useful because we can make the user interface respond to different situations dynamically. Another important aspect of JSX attribute is event handling. Modern web applications are interactive because they respond to user actions such as clicking buttons, typing text, moving the mouse, or pressing keys. React provides event handlers that allow developers to respond to these user interactions. The event handler attributes are usually connected to JavaScript functions. The close integration between JavaScript and HTML like syntax is one of the major reason why JSX is so powerful. As applications become larger, this approach helps developers organize their code more efficiently and reduce unnecessary complexity. One of the biggest advantages of JSX is conditional rendering. Conditional rendering means displaying different content based on certain conditions. Suppose a user has already logged into a website. In that case, React displays a welcome message. Otherwise, it asks the user to log in. This is commonly achieved using the ternary operator. Conditional rendering allows developers to create personalized user interfaces that respond dynamically to user actions. Now let us discuss the advantages one by one. The first advantage of JSX is improved code readability. One of the biggest challenges in software development is writing code that is easy to understand. Applications are often developed by teams of programmers, and the code written today may need to be maintained by someone else in the future. Since JSX closely resembles HTML, developers can easily understand the structure of the user interface by simply looking at the code. Even a beginner who has basic knowledge of HTML can quickly understand JSX because it uses familiar tags such as headings, paragraphs, buttons, forms, tables, and images. Compare this with writing the same interface using multiple function calls. That approach becomes lengthy and difficult to read. JSX provides a much cleaner and more organized way of describing the user interface, making the code easier to maintain and reducing the chances of misunderstanding among team members. The second advantage is that the JSX reduces development time. Developers can create user interfaces much faster using HTML like syntax than by writing multiple JavaScript function calls. Imagine building a web page with several buttons, images, navigation menus, forms, and tables. Writing all of these using create element would require a large amount of code and would take more time. With JSX, developers can simply write the structure in a way that looks almost identical to HTML. This allows them to focus on the application's functionality. As a result, project can be completed more quickly and developers become more productive. The third advantage is that the JSX support dynamic content. Modern web applications are expected to display information that changes continuously based on user action or data received from the server. JSX makes this possible by allowing JavaScript expressions to be embedded directly into the user interface. Whenever the underlying data changes, React automatically updates only the affected parts of the web page without refreshing the entire page. This makes applications more responsive and provides a better user experience. Another important advantage is that JSX works seamlessly with React components. As we will be learning in the next topic, React applications are built using components. A component is a reusable piece of the user interface that performs a specific task. JSX fits naturally inside these components, allowing developers to define the appearance and behavior of each component in one place. Once a component is created, it can be reused multiple times throughout the application. For example, if an application contains several buttons with same design, we do not need to write the button code repeatedly. We can create a single button component using JSX and use it wherever required. Another significant benefit of JSX is it makes debugging easier. When an error occurs, developers need to identify and fix the problem quickly. Since JSX closely resembles the actual user interface displayed in the browser, it becomes much easier to locate the source of an issue. For example, if a heading or button is not displayed correctly, developers can directly identify the corresponding JSX element because the code structure closely matches the outline screen on the screen. This clear relationship between the JSX code and the final web page reduces debugging time and helps developers identify mistakes more efficiently. In addition to these advantages, JSX also improves collaboration among development teams. Since the code is cleaner and more readable, new developers can understand existing projects more quickly. Overall, JSX combines the simplicity of HTML with the power of JavaScript. It improves readability, speeds up development, supports dynamic content, integrates perfectly with reusable React components, and simplifies debugging. Because of these benefits, JSX has become the standard approach for building React user interface. This diagram summarizes the complete life cycle of JSX from development to execution. The process begins with the developer writing JSX code using familiar HTML like syntax inside JavaScript files. Since browsers cannot understand JSX directly, the code is passed to Babel, which converts it into standard JavaScript using create element function calls. React then processes this JavaScript and creates a virtual DOM, which is a lightweight representation of the web page. Whenever the application state changes, React creates a new virtual DOM and compares it with the previous one through the reconciliation process. Only the parts that have actually changed are uploaded in the real DOM. The automatic workflow allows developers to focus on writing clean and readable code without worrying about browser compatibility or manual DOM manipulation. Next, let us summarize today's session. We learned that JSX or JavaScript XML is a syntax extension that allows developers to write HTML like code inside JavaScript. We discussed why JSX was introduced and how it simplifies user interface development compared to using create element directly. We explored the JSX compilation process where Babel converts JSX into standard JavaScript before execution. We also covered the essential syntax rules, including using a single parent element, closing all tags, writing attributes in camel case, and embedding JavaScript expressions within curly braces. In addition, we learned how JSX supports dynamic content, conditional rendering, and reusable React components, making it an essential part of modern React development. In the next lecture, we will continue by exploring React components, where we will learn how to create reusable user interface elements and build complete React applications efficiently.